What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So this particular video is a segment from the hour-long discussion between Sam Seder and Professor Walter Block. So I've had to cut this thing down to just directly address certain points that Sam makes about the minimum wage. I thought this would be a very interesting video. And I've linked the full interview in the description for anyone who wants to see it in its entirety. As much as I would prefer to play full clips and comment on them that way, this video would be a few hours long, and honestly, the discussion was not very impressive. I am a fan of Walter Block's work. I'd recommend anyone read Defending the Undefendable and watching Dr. Block's lectures, specifically on the privatization of roads and highways. He's done really awesome work about the privatization of everything. That's his big thing. But his showing in this exchange is pretty awful. He whines about Sam interrupting him constantly, which Sam really doesn't do much of, except to push back on Dr. Block to be specific at Sam's questions. At one point, Walter tells Sam that the conversation has been unfairly skewed, time-wise, against himself, which is really silly, because if anything, Dr. Block has had even more time to talk than Sam has once the discussion gets going. Combine that with the fact that Sam takes 2 minutes to finish a point because of his constant stutter, and, well, let's just say if we trim the fat off this thing, the discussion would only be about 15 minutes. And I'm also not going to use this as an opportunity to bash Sam Seder. I've seen a lot of his content. I've seen at least a dozen of his debates with libertarians and ANCAPs over the last couple of years, and basically, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, I completely disagree with his approach to government. I disagree with his takes on why government intervention is necessary in the market. But I don't hate the guy. I just find him sort of bland, and I do, however, find his crew in the background to be nauseatingly smug. This video is not as bad as others, but the crew constantly chimes in and chuckles and makes sarcastic jabs at the callers, and to me it comes off as the smug liberal douchiness that is prevalent in Bill Maher's audience. It's sort of the stereotype left-wingers are known for, despite a lot of them being embarrassingly ignorant about some of the most basic aspects of economics and what seemingly is their love of top-down authoritarianism aimed at everyone they disagree with. But without further delay, let's dig into this conversation, specifically the bits about minimum wage.
Well, for example, take the minimum wage law. That curtails it in the sense that I now offer you a job washing my car or whatever at $6 an hour, and let's say you would agree, and we can both go to jail for that. They probably wouldn't put you in jail because they would think I was exploiting you, but theoretically we could both go to jail because the minimum wage law is $7.25 an hour, and if we two consenting adults come to an agreement for $6 an hour, it's illegal. So our freedom to have an employment contract is, in that instance, curtailed.
And so how is that, how is the idea that I would get, I mean, when we talk about the minimum wage, the idea that I would get a living wage or a wage that could sustain me, how is that unethical, A, and how does it hurt us economically?
So Walter Block's case is that minimum wage is wrong economically because it prohibits by law the voluntary exchange of employment between two consenting parties for a wage lower than the state demands is acceptable. The specific example Dr. Block provides is an employee willing to work for $6 an hour, while the minimum wage law dictates that any wage under $7.25 an hour is illegal. Sam's rebuttal is to inquire how this hurts society economically to force employers to pay a living wage to that employee. And why is it unethical? Well, here's my rebuttal. In terms of why it's unethical because an authority with a monopoly on violence and force is coercing two people who are, in this example, both engaging in a voluntary transaction. It's unethical for the same reason that it would be unethical for the state to coerce these same two parties from being friends or even engaging in a sexual relationship. There is no distinction when it comes to voluntary peaceful agreements. The distinction is only made in the minds of authoritarians who wish to impose top-down control on peaceful and voluntary transactions. In fact, Sam is well aware that in this example both parties have consented to operate for this wage. But he finds that fact to be irrelevant. Sam feels he not only knows, but will impose through the force of the state what he feels is best for you. This is why the left, and most of the right for that matter, is inherently authoritarian. They know what's best for you, and they're going to force it on you. But they'll do it with a smile because it's for your own good. To the question of how it hurts society economically, living wage is a narrative that is crafted to make someone feel like they're doing good by imposing authority on voluntary economic transactions. The negative impacts on society at large is that regardless what the government sets the minimum wage at, the true minimum wage is zero. That's what people will earn if their labor is priced out of the market. This is obvious at higher wages. If someone's labor is profitable to hire at $8 an hour, they're not necessarily going to have labor profitability at $15 an hour. If a business will be losing money paying $15 an hour to an employee whose labor profitability is around $9 or $10 an hour, then that employer will be losing money by employing this person. Businesses aren't successful operating at a loss. Only the government can operate like that, because then it can just siphon more money from the tax base or print more money out of thin air, but we'll get into that here in a bit.
Well, I mean, let's say $20 an hour is sustainable, or what did you call it? I forget.
A living wage.
Living wage, sorry. Let's say $20 an hour is a living wage, and I'm offering you $6. Have I hurt you? Have I, in any sense, engaged in uninvited border crossing? Have I used coercion against you? No. I've not worsened your position. I don't know what your situation is right now, in hypothetical. I'm not talking about you as an actual person, rather you as a theoretical person. I come up to you and say, hey, come work for me for $6. What do you say? And, you know, if you can make $20 an hour at a living wage, will you say, well, thanks for your offer, but no thanks, if you're a polite person. If you're not polite, you'll say something else. On the other hand, if right now your wage is, say, $2 an hour, you'll say, whoop-de-doo, $6, that's great. So I think that either I can't hurt you, or possibly I can help you. Now, it would be nice if you were making $20 an hour, and if you were, then my offer of $6 will just sort of flow off your back like water off a duck's back. You're not going to seriously entertain it. But I haven't hurt you, I haven't violated your rights, and I might have improved your situation if your situation was much more dire, namely, say you were making $2 an hour, or you were unemployed and had no other job opening. $6 an hour is better than nothing.
Which is a great point Dr. Block just made. If I offer you $6 an hour and you can get $15 an hour or more elsewhere, obviously I haven't hurt you by just offering employment at $6 an hour. And if you're making less than $6 an hour, I've offered you something very useful that you can consider. In the end, it's all voluntary. That is, until Sam has his way.
Well, now let's talk about, though, living people. I mean, in when we talk about actual individuals, we know that in many instances, if you're making even, let's say, the minimum wage as it is now, never mind getting rid of it, many of those people cannot afford to feed their families without government assistance. They can't afford to get health care without government assistance. We're all well aware of the stories of how many Walmart workers are required to get nutritional assistance and medical assistance. We also know that in the case of, so I'm not sure how it's unethical that someone would receive a higher minimum wage.
Well, I've explained how it's unethical to violate a peaceful transaction between two consenting parties with force, but he added a lot here, so it's great to discuss this in detail. This is where Professor Block should have knocked it out of the park. It's almost a voluntarist ANCAP wet dream to have all these issues lined up like bowling pins to smash down. Sam's concern is, how can a person making $6 an hour afford to live off of those wages, and gives examples of the cost of healthcare, housing, food, and the high use of welfare and food assistance programs for low-wage workers. So I've made a two-part series on how the government has fucked up the American healthcare system, from certificate of need laws to the FDA being an inefficient government monopoly on approving drugs that are already legal in other places, to prohibiting the importing of drugs from other places, to regulation in healthcare raising prices, to reducing competition, to the federal government directly incentivizing employer-based healthcare. The government granting patent monopolies to pharmaceutical companies which prohibit competition and drive up prices all around healthcare in America is a great example of government incompetence, and when you add Medicare and Medicaid into the mix, it fucks up the cost even more, because now the citizen using private insurance is not only directly paying for the Medicare and Medicaid via taxation, but since the government doesn't negotiate prices, it just tells the doctors what money they're going to get, which is usually just cents on the dollar for the actual cost. And now to make up for the loss of the already inflated prices, doctors have to pass down that additional cost to those of us tied to our private health insurance. The entire thing is a mess, and government, yes, the government, in their brilliant altruistic attempts to help out, have turned a much more affordable, much more universal free market system into the clusterfuck that we have today. And next up was housing. How much cheaper would housing be without property taxes, rent control, and zoning laws, to name a few government fuck-ups? Sam later in this video will reference New York, specifically because the cost of living is so high in New York. But why is it so high, Sam? New York has zoning laws which restrict what and where new housing can be built. It has rent control laws which disincentivize new cheaper housing being built and worsens the quality of older cheaper housing already on the market. Aside from property taxes, New York and most blue states and major cities in general impose much higher taxes on their populace. And the issue ties directly into people needing government aid in general. How much further does $6 an hour go when the government isn't stealing and squandering a third or half of it? Federal income tax, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all taken right off the top, and that isn't it. New York, like many states, has a state income tax as well. Property taxes are high, then you have a sales tax, then you pay a tax on gas at the gas pump, you pay additional taxes on alcohol and tobacco, and if you live in a weed-friendly state and wish to partake, they will tax you on that as well. How does this get no mention in a conversation about helping broke people out? When you work for an employer, they get taxed on employing you. Then they are forced to match your Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid contributions. This comes out of your wages. Then your earnings are taxed both federally and then usually by the state. Some cities even invoke another tax. And then with the money you take home, you pay more taxes on everything you buy. Want to throw it in the stock market and make some money off of your already taxed money?
Uh-oh. Capital gains tax.
And if that isn't enough for you, the government, in its infinite wisdom, created a banking cartel which controls the money supply and interest rates which rape your savings. Wonder why most of the growth goes to the top 1%, Bernie fans? It's called the Federal Reserve. The wealthy buy up assets, the Fed inflates the dollar, and then the wealthy sell those assets to the middle class at higher costs. Where's the left on that? Oh, that's right. They need the Fed to deficit finance the giant nanny state that they want, so the problem must be capitalism. And what a great opportunity to drop some Rothbard into the conversation. This is taken from Murray Rothbard's amazing work on the Progressive Era. This is from a time where we had no minimum wage or a central bank. Quote, in terms of real wages, the average daily wage in all industry rose by 13% from 1865 to 1891, while the cost of living fell on average of 31% in the same period. The average daily real wages corrected for these price changes increased by 64%. Then when we consider that average hours worked dropped from 11 to 10 hours a day in this period, we can add 10% to the average real wage, which would boost it to 74%. So spectacular was the expansion of products that it outstripped the increase in the money supply during this period, so that overall prices fell steadily by 2.5% every year from 1870 to 1890. Today, the Federal Reserve aims at 2.5% to 3% inflation every year, which we actually get closer to probably 4%.
But also from an economic standpoint, we know that just there was a report today that I saw that raising the minimum wage will actually put an additional $35 billion. I mean, specifically when we're talking about the $10.10 an hour, it'll increase the wages of almost 29 million workers by $35 billion. And it will increase economic activity. How is that bad for the economy, and how is that unethical?
So Sam says the studies show that raising the wage from $7.25 an hour to $10.10 an hour, which used to be the big push for the Democrats, would help out a lot of working people. Now, I agree that the lower the minimum wage, the less damage it does. But still, anyone who finds their skills unprofitable to an employer at less than $10.10 an hour will find themselves unemployed. The Democrats, of course, now have gone further and have made the push for $15 an hour for the minimum wage. This, of course, is more than double the national minimum wage as it stands right now. So let's break all of this down. Sam said earlier that people can't live off the minimum wage now, let alone what they'll get without a minimum wage at all. And this comes from the idea that if government did not impose at least the current minimum wage or some other kind of wage standard, that employers are going to pay the absolute minimum that they possibly can. So what does the Bureau of Labor Statistics say about this? As of 2018, we have here the 2017 data of 80.4 million workers over the age of 16 are paid hourly wages. So that's about 58.3% of all the workers. So just over half of American workers are making hourly wages. I actually thought the number would have been much higher than that. But it says American workers at or below the minimum wage make up only 2.3% of all hourly paid workers. This number was even lower than the previous year of 2016. So only 2.3% of workers in the United States right now even make the minimum wage. If employers are only going to pay the bare minimum possible, why is it that such a tiny minority of workers are paid at or below the minimum? It's almost as if labor is like any other good in the market, in that it is subject to supply and demand. This is very interesting. So let's continue. Minimum wage workers tend to be young. Workers under 25 make up about half of the workers making the minimum wage. This is what you would expect as people get older to acquire new skills and job experience and continually move up the ladder and make more money. This is also why the top 1% is not a stagnant group of individuals. 80% of America's millionaires, for instance, are first-generation millionaires. Income mobility in the United States is very prevalent. This is why you want people who don't have a lot of skills to have more options to grow those skills in the beginning of their working life, as opposed to coercing every business in the country to double their starting wage. So look, this conversation goes on, even as President Biden has expressed vocal support for a $15 an hour minimum wage being imposed on every business in the country. But just look at the facts, not just of today's economy, but throughout history. The bottom line is this: freedom presents possibilities that authoritarian control strangles. We're not going to get a perfect world where we can centrally plan and fine-tune every detail of society, and the central planners aren't just not all-knowing. They are incapable of knowing, and they are incapable of being trusted with the power that people like Sam not only want to trust them with, but want to continue to expand so that they will eventually have more and more and more. Reject authoritarianism, embrace libertarianism and freedom.